welcome to this online conversation on the topic debt in the Global South. Start with a question to you, Marina Ponti. The debt crisis in the Global South is not a new phenomenon, but has been exacerbated since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, to the point that many experts regard it as the worst debt crisis ever. Why are so many developing countries facing rising debt burdens this decade?
Okay, thank you for the question and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to have this very important conversation. Let me start by saying that debt in itself is not a problem, because when you borrow money as an individual, as a company, as a government, it means that you have a project, that you have a dream, that you have a vision for a better future. However, if the condition of the loans are unfair, if the cost of borrowing becomes something spiraling out of hand, then that becomes a problem. And now we are in the middle of a global crisis. And as High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker said, many debt traps are becoming death trap for many developing countries. Let's say how, there are many reasons why this debt crisis is different from previous one. I want to focus and then, kickstart the discussion on three main reasons. First, of course, is the magnitude of the problem. Beyond, the number, let's just say to explain, compared to 2010, debt has increased tenfold. So we're looking at extraordinary number never recorded before. And there is a lot of, so the magnitude is big, but then also we are in front of very unfair borrowing rates. Developing countries borrow on the market, on the capital, at rates that are 2 to 4 times higher than the United States, for instance, and 6 to 12 times higher than a country like Germany. Mm-hmm. So somehow when the condition for borrowing, when the cost of borrowing is so much higher, then of course this adds up to creating a debt crisis. As UN and Trade Development, the latest report, A World of Debt, state, we live in a world today where 3.3 billion people, which is more or less 40% of the population, live in countries that pay more on servicing the debt alone than on health and education. So this is also the unfair and unsustainable high cost of borrowing. And then the third difference with the past is somehow the configuration of debt. In the past, most of the debt was owed to either development multilateral banks or to national government or bilateral donors. Now, 60% of the debt is owed to private lenders, banks or other, capital fund or other shareholders. And of course, this makes the borrowing more costly, extremely volatile. Private lender can pull out without any notice. And this make extremely, difficult also to manage and to access, lending. So I think these are three of there are also many other, we can kind of continue the conversation, but in my view, these are the three most important difference with crisis in the past.
Thank you, Marina, for these insights. Ms. Salihu, do you have anything to add or any reaction?
I completely agree with all the points that she mentioned. I would also like to add that in the Global South, especially in my country, Nigeria, I believe that at the household level, unemployment that was experienced during the COVID-19 period increased household borrowing. In addition, there were, global supply chain issues and shutdowns during the pandemic. And then this significantly influenced the profitability of most small businesses and large corporations. So as a result of this, the channel of revenue generation from sources like corporate tax and value-added tax, was, significantly affected. So you now have a situation where this government had to look towards external, alternative sources of finance. And then, it's all linked together: unemployment and, increased borrowing, loan defaults at the national level.
Thank you. So indeed, the COVID-19 was an external shock that exacerbated the problem, and also, as Marina mentioned, the global financial markets with those interest rates very high. That's also that has a very big impact on the servicing of debt. And I understand that this is important factors in the problem. Now I will ask the questions to you, Ms. Salihu. Developing countries are grappling with growing concerns over debt sustainability and their economic and social development. The rising cost of sovereign debt has led to a worsening of external debt sustainability, leading developing nations to delay important investment in favor of debt servicing. What could or should be done to stop this vicious circle? And second question, to what extent a modern version of the Jubilee, that is debt cancellation, could inspire strategies for a more just and equitable system of debt?
Okay. So in order to tackle this vicious circle of unsustainable debt, we need to focus on establishing some structures and framework. They need to be on ground. For example, we need to improve the capacity and independence of watchdog and civil society organizations. For example, in Nigeria, we have something called Tracker. We have the Magambe network in Zimbabwe. In Zambia, we have Zambia Participates. So these organizations have been tremendously helpful in educating citizens and applying significant pressure on governments and generally fostering, fiscal transparency and accountability. In addition, accountability on its own needs to be improved. And this is tied to what Marina said, that generally countries in the global south seem to be paying an unreasonable and unfair amount of interest on borrowed funds. And from my background in accounting and finance, there is usually a higher premium paid on issued bonds based on the perception of corruption. So corruption is a major issue that needs to be tackled head on immediately and completely. In addition, we need to improve the strategy and implementation and efficiency of projects that are executed from borrowed funds. So I'm going to talk about something called White Elephant projects in Nigeria. So, and I'll cite an example of, in some communities or counties, provinces, I would say, some state governors have been known to, execute FIFA standard stadiums, international airports in communities that have little to no access to pipe-borne water or stable electricity. So we have to implement, efficiency at the planning stage and at the implementation stage of this project. In addition, like Marina pointed out, that businesses and countries need debt to function. Generally, there are some countries in the, I would say, developed areas like Japan, Singapore, and Canada that have a higher debt to GDP ratio than some of the borrower countries in the global south. So it means that, and when we look at these countries, we are going to observe that they have more infrastructural development, they have more efficient and sustainable revenue generation models. So this needs to be implemented, in order to stop this vicious cycle. And then back to the second question, you talked about, if I'm correct, that to what extent can debt relief be, efficient? Am I right? So I would say I somewhat agree that debt cancellation is going to be helpful. However, some of the structures that I spoke about need to be on ground. And I'm going to cite another example. In 2007 in Nigeria, debt cancellation was secured from the Paris Club. And afterwards, there was an improvement in, macroeconomic indices, improvement in creditworthiness, an increase in foreign direct investment. However, 19 years afterwards, that amount of debt owed externally has ballooned from about 2.1 billion to over $42 billion. And, we still have poor infrastructural development. So it's important that we have some structures on ground before and after this debt relief process starts, if we want the benefits to be long-lived.
Thank you very much, Ms. Salihu, for these insights. So there are internal factors like corruption, but there are also external factors. I believe, Ms. Ponti, would you like to add other elements? Or?
Yes, I think I fully agree with everything Anazuo said. I think she brought very good point. I just have a few feedback. I fully agree with the issue of fighting corruption. We at the campaign, we ran an SDG Action Awards prize, and in 2019, Follow the Money, an organization from Nigeria, won. They are supporting civil society and local journalists to track funds and ensure accountability. So accountability is key. Also, a second point, which you mentioned before, Anazuo, spot on, is about taxation. Debt and taxation are the, two sides of the same coin. So on one side, we need to address the debt issue, but we also need to look at more efficient and progressive and fair taxation mechanism, not only from domestic resource mobilization, but from international, the extractive industry or international companies. I think we all know the figures of how much developing countries lose every year on tax evasion or tax avoidance, which again can be, these are resources taken away from investment in people and in the planet. So I think taxation is a very important interlinked topic. And then you mentioned something else about, how credit rating agency play a role. As of today, credit rating agencies are only based in the US. I know there is a movement, to kind of suggest that they're also creating more neutral one. And somehow this perception of the information they use make, of course, borrowing from country more risky and then more expensive. And somehow those decisions are made in a very opaque and closed-door way, and the data on which they're based are not made public for the country to understand and for the people to understand the situation. So I think another issue very important in addressing that is transparency. Transparency of the player, transparency on the condition, on the negotiation. And last point, you mentioned about finding new mechanisms, new inclusive mechanisms that include, lenders and borrowers, both public and now also private, in fora, perhaps under the UN, where all governments have a seat and where, again, the issue and the principle of fairness, inclusivity, and transparency can be utilized.
Thank you, Ms. Ponti. Indeed, those principles are key, I guess, transparency, fairness, inclusivity. Thank you very much for this insight. I will address my next questions to you, Ms. Ponti. So do you think there's an economic and moral imperative for the cancellation of external debt in the face of current pressing challenges?
Yes, definitely. I think we are in a jubilee year. So every 25 years for not only the Catholic, I think there's been at the G20 very recently a call from all interfaith leaders to call for cancellation. And particularly if we look at low-income countries, debt cancellation as a measure to kind of reset the debate is something economically feasible and will allow government to really invest where they need to address the climate crisis and also to advance social and economic development. So I think debt cancellation is feasible, also because if we look at, for instance, in the climate sphere, at the amount of, those who are polluting and those who are somehow paying the consequences of climate change, we see that there is so far a net transfer of resources from developing country to developed country. So I think in light of fairness, it will be really possible to do a cancellation in this year. Also, we have a conference coming up at the UN in Spain called Financing for Development, where that plays a crucial role. So there is a momentum to find a solution. We should be short-term canceling the debt, again, is feasible, and particularly on the creditor side, the private one, they've been benefiting by this premium interest rate for so many years that they could absorb as they do. I mean, they charge a premium that it means there is risk associated, and this is one. So I think it's a totally economically viable. At the same time, I think governments and private sector and private creditor should come together to find longer-term solution. We cannot go from one crisis to the other. So just the short-term cancellation is not the answer. We need to create a fora where, condition, where transparency, inclusivity, where fairness is taken into consideration. Also, the principle of responsible borrowing and lending. Sometimes loans are actually disbursed when it's clear that the government cannot repay them. So I think there has to be a equal responsibility on both sides. If you are lending money knowing that this will not return, somehow you are part of the problem. So I think all these issues should be discussed in a more transparent way. And also we are facing an emergency, climate, a social emergency. We're looking at the deepening of inequalities across the globe. Probably, one of the cause was COVID, and then there are conflict emerging. So we need to allow government to, with the right, accountability to their people, but to invest in a better future for the future generation, and also to increase, the life expectancy, education, and give infrastructure, build infrastructure, and give opportunity, particularly to young people.
Thank you. Ms. Salihu, do you share the view of Ms. Ponti, or do you have a different view?
I completely 100% agree. And she rounded up by talking about improving opportunities for young people. So with regards to economic imperatives and viability, we need to consider issues like brain drain. So due to poor infrastructure and issues like, lack of job opportunities, we've seen an increased migration of talented individuals in critical sectors like health and IT. So they are moving from the global south to developed countries. So this is just another incentive or motivation to kickstart this process of debt relief.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So my last questions, I will address it to you, Ms. Salihu. Many see the current global financial architecture as dysfunctional. Recently, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the global financial system morally bankrupt, as it is a system created by rich countries to benefit rich countries. Do we need a reform of international financial institutions?
I somewhat agree that we need some form of reform because, and we can draw from history, from the 80s, where institutionalized lenders somewhat forced some form of austerity on borrower countries through the structural adjustment program, of which some of these countries are still going through, the turmoil from this, experience. In addition, institutionalized lenders have, from history, they've been established to provide financial support to leaders from the global south that have been alleged to violate human rights and are corrupt. And in addition, I would say that there isn't a truly democratic, representation on leadership in, these institutions. However, I have observed some form of reforms, and I think this should be encouraged and celebrated. So earlier this year, the World Bank, for example, penalized and debarred about 2 companies in Nigeria for a 30-month period due to corruption and fraud allegations and, infringement of integrity standards of the institution. So earlier in 2021, about 57 companies went through similar, punitive measures. So I believe that these are the kinds of reforms that should be encouraged.
Encourage reform. Thank you. Ms. Ponti, would you like to add something to that point?
Yes. I'm super aligned. Just the 2 additional points. The current international financial architecture were designed 80 years ago, where, like many of the developing countries, were still colonies. So we live in a totally different world, and those and the distribution of shareholder, of veto power, of votes are still reflecting a reality which is not current. So as any institution that wants to be effective in current times, the international financial architecture should be reformed to be more inclusive to today's reality in terms of economic powers, in terms of also many more voices and many more countries, and also the previous, 80 years ago, the main goal of this architecture was to ensure prosperity and stability for all. We see that today there is a deepening of inequalities. We don't see prosperity for all, and we even don't see any stability, and we live in a very unstable. So somehow the current architecture is unfit for its purpose and needs urgent reform. Again, in the Financing for Development Conference at the end of June, there will be an opportunity to hopefully discuss how we can make this new architecture more inclusive and representative of all interests and of all countries. And so this is really important.
So the global financial architecture is unfit for the purpose and needs urgent reform. Thank you very much for your insights on this very important topic.